We'll let others join and we'll begin shortly, just after the top of the hour. Okay, good afternoon and welcome to ATP-Bio's public webinar series. We will be hearing about what would bioethics for agriculture and food applications of cryopreservation look like. My name is Alyssa Berger and I am ATP-Bio's Administrative Director. I'm headquartered at the University of Minnesota. I'd like to introduce our Ethics and Public Policy co-lead, Professor Susan Wolf, who will be serving as our moderator today. And Susan will further introduce our guest presenter, Professor Paul Thompson, who joins us from Michigan State University. And before we jump into the presentation, I'd like just to highlight a couple upcoming public webinars hosted both by ATP-Bio and the Society for Cryobiology. So please note these dates and plan to join us again in the future. And for those within the ATP-Bio community, we do have a couple upcoming closed webinars, our DCI cafes and closed forums in just a few weeks. So Susan, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Great.
Paul.
Thank you, Alyssa. And thanks for everyone joining us today. Welcome to the second webinar of the academic year from ATP-Bio's Ethics and Public Policy component, EPP. I'm Susan Wolf, as Alyssa said, Regents Professor of Law and Medicine at the University of Minnesota, and lead for EPP together with my colleague, Professor Tim Pruitt. Each EPP webinar features a member of our distinguished Ethics and Public Policy panel, EP3, and today is no exception. We're excited to welcome Professor Paul Thompson from Michigan State University to speak on what would an agricultural ethics of advanced biopreservation technology look like. This is, of course, a central question for ATP-Bio because a whole tranche of its envisioned applications falls in the domains of agriculture, aquaculture, and food systems, as well as assembly of faunal biobanks. So this is really a core set of issues for all of us at ATP-Bio. Professor Thompson's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have QA, and I'll ask you to use the raised hand function in Zoom. We are recording so that other colleagues who aren't able to join us at this hour can access the presentation later. So let me too briefly introduce Professor Paul Thompson. He was the inaugural occupant of the Kellogg Chair in Agricultural, Food, and Community Ethics at Michigan State, which he held from 2003 to 2022. Professor Thompson really is the country's leading philosopher of agricultural and food systems. He now serves as emeritus faculty in the departments of philosophy, community sustainability, and agricultural, food, and resource economics. His research and teaching has long focused on the ethical and philosophical issues raised by food and agriculture. And among the many publications are two books I just want to bring to your attention. One has got a great title. I still love this title, Paul. From Field to Fork, Food Ethics for Everyone, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. And his book, The Spirit of the Soil, Agriculture and Environmental Ethics, was released in a revised and updated second edition in 2017. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Paul.
Okay, let me get this rolling here. See if I can make that work. I think people can see that now. So this is my topic, and I'm gonna see if I can get the slides to advance. I always have to do something weird here. There we go. So I do have some disclosures. In addition to my participation in this project, I do have a couple of external grants, one from USDA and one from NSF. And I serve without compensation on some animal welfare advisory boards. I've ripped off a lot of images from web pages, but I've tried to make sure I'm not violating any intellectual property in doing so. My talk's going to cover an extremely broad, expansive material, and it's going to be kind of jerky. I'm just kind of going to flip from one thing to the other. So here's a roadmap for everyone. I'm going to start out by explaining my curious title, and then I'm going to give a very brief overview of the food and agricultural applications for advanced cryopreservation tools and techniques, essentially the aspect of the ATP-Bio project that Susan just described. I'm going to lump the ethical argument for pursuing these kinds of activities under a pretty broad umbrella that covers a lot of research in agriculture and food systems. And then I'm going to give a equally broad overview of some of the concerns that are sometimes raised against technical change in agriculture and food before finishing up with some comments on procedural ethics and the institutional capacity for this kind of work. So with my title, I'm going to presume that my audience today is somewhat familiar with bioethics as it's currently practiced in medical schools and biomedical research. And what I mean by bioethics is a multidisciplinary domain of research and education. It's focused on normative dimensions of medical practice and biomedical technology, and I include moral, legal, religious, aesthetic, cultural under that normative umbrella. When I say there's this domain, I mean to indicate that there's no medical schools in the United States and increasingly throughout the industrialized world that don't have capacities in bioethics. Many have entire departments that include faculty from law and philosophy and some of the social sciences focused on bioethical issues. But when we turn to agriculture, there's nothing really remotely comparable that exists at agricultural universities and research institutes. So this means that this kind of structured capacity for analysis, critical review of the merits, and integration of multiple perspectives, disciplinary traditions, and respectful advocacy for normative positions that we associate with bioethics, and especially across these technically complex issues with participation from the relevant STEM fields. In other words, these bioethics programs in the medical context have significant participation from people with the STEM expertise in the fields. If we were to have an agricultural ethics of any kind of new technology, we would need a similar kind of community of practice. But in fact, this community of practice just doesn't exist. I could do this metaphorically by saying that bioethics is kind of a pack activity, but I feel a little bit like a lone wolf in giving this talk today. I just don't really have the kind of institutional framework that I think you see in the medical context. So what I'm going to do is give a speculative and very general overview of the issues that this community might take up with respect to advanced biopreservation technology if it existed. But I'm also going to stress this idea that the need for such a community may be the key ethical issue in itself, and the lack of such a community may be one of the most troubling aspects of really many technological innovations in the context of agriculture and food. So if I turn now to a very brief overview, I'm going to focus strictly on the applications. I'm not going to talk about how any of these things work. And I'm going to talk about three principal areas of application for some of the techniques being developed in ATP-Bio. I'll start with the cold storage for food and food products. Storage technologies in the context of agriculture and food are also critical for transportation. There's essentially a few purposes that they're intended to serve. Obviously, they're intended to retard the natural ripening process to inhibit the growth of microorganisms in foods. And they also tend to make the products more compact, transportable, and some of these technologies will reduce weight. And we have a lot of these that go back centuries, and we should really see the storage technologies that are being developed in this within the context of these broader technologies. So when we're going to evaluate cryopreservation, we're going to be evaluating it in terms of its advantages and disadvantages with this already existing set of tools. Also, crucially, we have Clarence Birdseye, who in the 30s developed flash freezing techniques for many foods. And I'm presuming we all have some familiarity with these frozen foods. And one of the significant advantages of Birdseye's work that it achieved most of the key goals that we associated with these storage technologies while preserving much higher sensory quality and allowing you to have access to a food that was much closer to fresh. However, the suitability of flash freezing really varies product by product. Some products don't freeze particularly well. My favorite is strawberries. Actually, I like to unfreeze strawberries because I like mushy strawberries, but they don't in any way resemble a fresh strawberry. And part of the goal of the isochoric techniques that are being developed under ATP-Bio would be to improve product quality and food safety for foods that are less amenable to some of the Birdseye techniques. Turning rapidly to biopreservation of reproductive cells for assisted reproduction in food animal species. This is an area that overlaps with some of the medical applications. I'll just mention that artificial insemination of cattle is a very mature technology, and it's used in conjunction with genetic improvement, not only by researchers, but by producers. Producers are able to use this technology and manage the genetics of their herds. In addition, fertilization in vitro fertilization is less commonly used in agriculture, but usage is growing, and it's certainly an available technology. It has primarily been used with these high-value animals like cows and slightly lesser to swine. But if we were able to develop improved methods that would have a higher success rate, it might make it more attractive for use in poultry species and especially in aquaculture. So we'd be essentially extending a technology that's quite mature with respect especially to cattle into some other species. And finally, biobanking for crop and livestock species. In some respects, this is a technology that should be seen in context with gardens, conservatories, and orangeries that started to appear in the 18th century as ways to make plants and the genetics of plants available for agricultural research and development. Nikolai Vavilov is often credited as the father of the modern seed bank, where you're storing seeds, often in sub-zero facilities. And if we have some of the innovations in biopreservation, we could improve the efficiency even in plants and get a larger percentage of stored specimens that would maintain fertility and be useful. But perhaps most significantly, we'd be able to extend some of these techniques in biobanking to animal species, which currently it's proven difficult to store some of these reproductive materials. So I want to emphasize the point that these are, in the context of agriculture, and maybe this is a point that differs from the biomedical context, these are not really revolutionary technological developments. They extend things that have been done for a long time, and their promise is that they allow us to extend them farther, perhaps into some new products, perhaps with improved efficiencies in terms of achieving some of the key goals, or perhaps even some cost efficiencies. So there's a very general argument for pursuing this kind of technology in agriculture. And I want to review that again at a fairly high level, right? Agricultural science and engineering have always aimed to increase the productivity of land, labor, and more recently capital in agricultural production and food processing. And this overarching ethical argument, I could go on at quite length about this. I've sat through a number of presentations that have gone on for an hour or more making this argument. But here are some of the highlights. Agricultural production is a potentially renewable resource, and so it sort of fits within, at least could fit with a nation of sustainable consumption. But doing that involves making the production process less resource consumptive and having fewer impacts on the non-farm environment. It's also an important source of livelihood, especially in less industrialized regions. There are African countries where we still have in excess of 80% of the population employed in Africa in agriculture. It's critical to economic development beyond agriculture itself, because in many rural areas, plant and animal production supports some of the social services in rural areas. And of course, generally increasing the food supply supports the basic human right to food and increases human welfare through reducing the cost of food and fiber goods. Perhaps more significantly from an ethics perspective, agricultural production has overlaps with distributive justice. So on a global level, currently between 50% and 70% of the people in extreme poverty, which according to the World Bank standard is less than €1 per day of income, are farmers. So things that we do to benefit farmers have a disproportionate positive impact in terms of economic development. Perhaps equally significantly, the food budget consumes a larger portion of income for less well-off people, and this would be true even in industrialized countries. So anything that you're doing that reduces the cost of food has a greater proportional benefit to the poor. So agricultural research just sort of generally fits with this Rawlsian criterion of benefiting the worst off group. I just want to stress that this is ethically significant. It takes sort of the general arguments that I was describing on the earlier page that seem kind of utilitarian, and they couple them with strongly egalitarian principles of judgment. So this is again a powerful general argument for increasing productivity in agriculture, and it would encompass many of the technologies that we're talking about in ATP-Bio. However, these are all defeasible goods, and what that means is that they can be offset or controverted by countervailing ethical considerations. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shift ground and discuss some of the considerations that are often raised against innovations. And again, I'll be speaking very generally. So I'm not asserting that biopreservation tools fall prey to these considerations, but they are the kind of things that if you have a robust functional agricultural ethics, they need to be taken into account. So why am I not asserting that? Well, I have many reasons, but importantly, food systems are complex. So negative arguments might apply in some crops or some geographical regions, within some cultural contexts, and not in others. In addition, there's a lot of stuff happening in agriculture and food right now. We're actually seeing a very dramatic introduction of robotics and artificial intelligence into agricultural production. We're seeing nanotechnology-enabled sensing technologies, and of course we have tremendous advancements in genetics. And so these things are all interacting, and so any analysis which really penned some of these concerns about agricultural innovation to a single technology, I think would be suspect. So I'm going to speak again at a very general level, and I'm going to discuss three just categories to, in many respects, exemplify some of these. So starting out with the potential for harm to sentient beings, that would include people, but also livestock. We have some well documented things, Tractor rollovers are apparently the leading cause of farm deaths. More familiar, we have pesticide exposures to agricultural labor. We also have debates on the current methods of raising livestock in industrial production systems. I'm not going to talk much about these animal issues, but I will note that at present, animal protection groups oppose, not all, but many oppose artificial insemination in farmed animals. Their reasons are complicated. Partly it's because they oppose farming animals, but they also see these as stressful technologies. So that would presumably apply to some of the technologies that are being developed in ATP-Bio. So I'm going to focus on people, and I'm going to, for simplification, just focus on food safety as a key way in which there are adverse impacts on people. So the general standard for food safety risk throughout the industrialized world is de minimis. And de minimis means that hazards should be minimized, and in no case should an innovation increase the chance of morbidity or mortality from food consumption. So you don't introduce something new if it's going to introduce new risks or increase the probability of a hazard or make a hazard potentially more severe. Now, from a regulatory standpoint, it's important to just bear in mind that this is actually a pretty complicated landscape. A lot of the key food safety regulation is strictly local in the United States. It's done sometimes at the level of the metropolitan area. Sometimes it's done at the state level. There are federal standards and some inspections that are conducted both by the USDA and by the FDA. But I would argue that tort law, in other words, the fear of being sued and the reputational damage that goes along with it, may actually be doing a lot of the real work for enforcing food safety in the food industry. So turning so much from the regulation, which would, again, get us off on a tangent, and thinking specifically about the ethics, I want to just hone in on this word safety. Because in the context of food safety is understood almost entirely in terms of toxicity. And when we look at these risks and see the ways in which they're managed, they're focused on the introduction of toxins, either through contamination or through some natural process that occurs in terms of food development. But from an ethics standpoint, we might want to ask, should we be considering nutrition along with the toxic impacts of a new technology? And this is not necessarily a downside. I think we could quite reasonably ask whether de minimis is always the right standard. This is a map here that is a review of food security risk index, and the red areas are areas where food insecurity is the highest. And we could certainly envision technological innovations that might have positive impacts on food security, but might introduce some relatively low level of toxic risk into a food system. So I think it's at least open for an agricultural ethics discussion to consider whether or not this insistence on de minimis is actually ethically justified. But as we turn to some of these cryopreservation techniques, these are, especially the isochoric freezing, is essentially can be seen as a food safety technology. It's this little graphic, which I stole from the CDC's website, ends with chill. And chill does not mean have a martini and relax. It means, put your food in the refrigerator or the freezer. And this is intended to, again, retard the growth of microorganisms and spoilage. But let's ask the question, should we be considering nutrition when we evaluate the safety of these techniques? We go back to Clarence Birdseye and his frozen peas. That's a food safety technology relative to even canning, but some of the other food technologies, storage technologies we were discussing, there were improvements in safety, improvements in toxicity, But if you do what I did, which is Google unsafe frozen food, you'll get images like this. And it's not really clear from an ethics standpoint that we should see, even if there are these toxicity management benefits, that we should see this as a winning technology from an ethics standpoint. So it's at least a topic to discuss. Some of these convenience factors may have come under consideration. So turning to this second general category, I think when this notion of environmental impact comes up, a lot of times people think about pesticide exposures. And I just want to say that, from a kind of the standpoint of ethics, I'm not saying that's unreasonable, but that really belongs up here in this first category. So I'm really trying to define some different senses of environmental impact here in this context. And one of the things that we might point to would be impacts of agriculture on non-target species. There are certain bugs that we want to kill, and there are other bugs that we might kill. We also might impact animals and plants just by tearing up a pristine ecosystem and converting it into agriculture. So agriculture is going to have environmental impacts inevitably, and these are not so much harm to the bee. It's not like, it's much more a kind of species or group or ecosystem level impact that we're talking about. And this fits into the notions of biodiversity preservation. So often some of these efficiency increasing activities are justified on the grounds that they're actually contributing to this, because when you are able to get more food production on a smaller area, or with fewer environmental impacts, you're saving room for nature. You're not sort of having to increase the food supply by bringing new areas under cultivation. But there's also a piece here that really focuses on agriculture itself. And one of the things that one of the ways you can have a negative environmental impact in agriculture is to introduce a technology that over the long run and into the future actually negatively affects the integrity of the agricultural ecosystem itself. This is, of course, the Dust Bowl. And these arguments, this is the only mention I'm going to make of climate change, but it's a major part of the picture when we look at agricultural innovation in the present. There will be predictions of loss of cultivatable areas associated with sea level rise, increase in storms, and a number of things. So again, these are kind of reasons why you might want to be involved in some innovation. So if I ask, where does biopreservation fit into this picture? Again, these are part of the technologies that are associated with sustainable intensification. Sustainable intensification is kind of a buzzword for this idea that we should be increasing the productivity of our agriculture and in order to feed people in the future. I would just note, however, that there are critics who see sustainable intensification and feed the future just as greenwashing of industrial agriculture. So there is an established debate over the extent to which these productivity enhancing techniques are preserving a kind of agriculture which has brought us a lot of these problems in the first place. So I don't really see how biopreservation involves a unique threat to biodiversity or the integrity of agricultural ecosystems. So my point here would be that if it's seen as perpetuating industrial agriculture, it could nevertheless get embroiled in what is a pretty complex ethical and policy-related debate. So turning down to this last category, which would be socioeconomic impacts, I think it's going to be useful to revisit the debate over the first generation of gene technologies. And although it's kind of been forgotten outside of agriculture, the first important product in agriculture was recombinant bovine somatotropin, or recombinant growth hormone. I'm sure many of you know that human growth hormone was one of the earliest products. It's a recombinantly produced drug used in medicine. And as soon as it did that, well, why can't we do it for other animals? And in the case of recombinant BST for dairy cattle, we had a technology that when it's administered to lactating dairy cows, it boosts milk production. You get more production per cow, and it also extends the lactation cycle. You can milk cows for a longer period of time before you need to have them go into another calving cycle. In a nutshell, you get more milk per cow. However, milk has been in chronic oversupply for decades, right? And so what this means, and this research was done in the 1980s, economists predicted that we would need fewer cows if we introduced recombinant BST. And we don't know exactly what the cows thought of that. But more significantly, the economists predicted that we would need fewer dairy farms as a result of this. Now, this is the 1980s, and the 1980s was an era when we went through an enormous farm crisis in the United States. About half of the farms in the United States went out of business and were consolidated over the course of the 1980s. We went from about 5% of the total population in farming to a little over 2%, 2.5% or thereabouts. And so the impact of this was to create an anti-gene technology constituency among the advocates for these smaller scale family farms that were going out of business. And lacking any kind of regulatory basis for pursuing these sort of, let's protect our farmers, let's keep them from going out of business, let's stop RBST. RBST was approved. They resorted to pressing the issues of animal health and food safety. Now, that's kind of a story about the GMO debate, but from an ethics perspective, the real question here is, why should we care, right? I mean, we don't get all upset when dry cleaners, small-scale dry cleaners start going out of business. Why should we be upset about farmers? And I'll just say briefly that this is really one of the most convoluted and controversial issues in agricultural ethics. So I'm going to speak at an even broader level of generality here. So surely we could view farm bankruptcy as an ethically significant form of harm to farm operators. They're the ones that lose their farms. They go out of business. But it's important to recognize, and I will not go into the details, that this is very specific. These kinds of economic harms, people going out of business because of competition and technological innovation, are specifically excluded by John Stuart Mill and what's probably the classic philosophical statement of the do no harm principle. So his notion is that we don't think about that because we can kind of expect some of these broader social benefits that I was outlining earlier in the presentation. So we really need some sort of ethical argument that explains why farms and farmers are an exceptional case, why these farm businesses need to be viewed differently from other kinds of economic activities. And we have to recognize that maybe there isn't such an argument. I think one of the positions that gets argued and deserves to be argued here is that really we shouldn't be making these kinds of exceptions for farmers. But turning a little bit to the way some of these exceptional arguments get made, it's worth noting that we already spend here in the United States, and this would be true in Europe and really virtually all of the industrialized countries, we spend quite a bit of money trying to keep these farmers in business. So at a minimum, there's a matter of consistency in our policy goals. Why would we spend all this money to keep them in business and not monitor technology that might put them out of business? So if we don't think that farmers warrant some kind of special consideration, why would we do this? And again, there's a long list. Sometimes it appeals to the notion that farmers are good environmental stewards. Sometimes it appeals to the notion that they are better citizens. Sometimes it's a kind of local, know your farmer, and certainly in many cultural and philosophical traditions, The farmer is a venerated figure. We see that in certain aspects of Western traditions, but also in the Confucian tradition. And going into these details, I mean, I'm already getting close to my time, and I gotta not do that. So I'll just mention one example. Many European countries have started subscribing to what they call multi-functional agriculture, and my favorite example is this. Austrian farmers are paid to use traditional haystacks. They don't bundle their hay up in big rolls like we do here in the United States, on the grounds that these haystacks support cultural and aesthetic values, and they also are valuable for supporting tourism. So this is the kind of thing that might get cited here. Now, as with environmental impact, there's no obvious reasons why biopreservation techniques are especially problematic. They're not, they're not, I don't see anything about the technologies that I've outlined that is going to especially challenge, but it is true that this trajectory of earlier technologies have eroded both the farmer's share of returns. In other words, the consumer's food dollar now has to be shared with the technology companies as well as with the farmer. And it also has eroded their direct control over the production process. They are often really sort of put in a position where they don't really have a choice about some of the use of some of these technologies. I can say more about that in questions if it's necessary. So it's important to, and I'd also come back to this point I made earlier, that it's important to consider interactive impact when we think about these things. And I'll note that, in fact, just as predicted, consolidation of the dairy industry occurred. But it was doubtful that this had happened because farmers started using RBST. As a matter of fact, dairy farmers have in general decided not to use this. This is the offending technology. It's the little ear tag with the barcode on it. It had a dramatic effect on reducing the management costs in the dairy industry, but it required computerizing your dairy, which involved eventually assembling a lot of data collection technologies. It made it much more efficient to operate a dairy at a larger scale. You're not taking all of your records by pencil and paper or keeping it in your head. There's no reason why you can't be farming 10,000 cows instead of 70 or even a couple of hundred. So in a nutshell, wrapping this up, I'd say that although I think some of these socioeconomic arguments really need to be taken seriously, a truly functional agricultural ethics would have to weigh them in context of some of these other rationales. So that brings us finally back to the point we started at the beginning, which I'm going to restate in terms of procedural ethics and institutional capacities. So all of the things that I've been talking about so far are substantive ethical considerations, and I can explain this pretty simplistically by saying a substantive consideration is what makes something ethically right or wrong, and as in the law, a procedural reason is the ethically proper way to evaluate a substantive consideration. So the way you go about making that evaluation. And I would say that the creation of bioethics programming in biomedical research institutes is a procedural response to substantive issues in healthcare and innovative medical technology. It is a way to go about considering and managing issues that would be enormously chaotic and difficult to manage in the absence of that capacity. But again, as I said at the beginning, nothing comparable exists in agricultural universities and research institutes. So with that theme, I will stop sharing my screen and hopefully I've saved some time for questions.
Thank you, Paul. That was terrific. So again, I'm going to encourage people to use the raise hand function. And I see Jim Childress. Jim?
Paul, let me join Susan in thanking you for this clear, illuminating, and helpful presentation, exactly what we would have expected. So thank you. Let me just raise one issue about framing. And you at times and in your abstract for this suggested that we needed a bioethical agricultural, that we need a bioethical agricultural bioethics. And then much of the rest of the time you focused on agricultural ethics. I've been one of those long suspicious of the term bioethics because it seems to me to confuse more than it illuminates.
Right.
It seems to me to be unnecessary. Having a single term that suggests a kind of specialized area, but then we have engineering ethics and business ethics and so forth. And so I would much prefer sort of the agricultural ethics. So what I would like to invite you to do at this point is actually say what the bioethics part contributes to this. When it seems to me you can get everything you need by just having agricultural ethics. And then as you were saying something about what the bioethics framing brings to it, help me see whether it's substantive or procedural. And often it seems to me at the end you were focused on, well, bioethics has been used, especially in the medical area, to generate institutional capacity and thus setting up a context for the scholarly endeavor. But so at any rate, that's my question, is sort of what is the function here of bioethics when it seems to me that ethics would be sufficient?
Yeah, I've often said that actually it's just ethics, right? I think part of the reason we got bioethics was because there was a perceived need to address questions in especially in some of the innovative medical technologies that we started seeing coming online in the 60s and 70s. And actually some of the practices, of course, as you well know, just in terms of the way medical and human research was being conducted. It wasn't like this was not something that wasn't just part of ethics, but it really needed a special impetus and it needed some sort of direction for people to start doing this. And I mean, let me just put it in a nutshell. The people that were populating philosophy departments in the 1960s weren't about to start doing this just on their own initiative. They had other things they were doing. So creating this institutional capacity was really critical for getting it done. I would, I think I didn't actually start using this bioethics term myself until I really recognized that it is this creation of a capacity that is what really is in some respects the great value of bioethics as an activity. It has created an accompanying activity for biomedical research and just for the practice of medicine itself that I think has, on the one hand, it's allowed things to be aired. I think it's created the sense that issues are being taken seriously, even by people who ultimately disagree with the drift that things take. But it also, I think, has created this place in which the questions are asked and answered, and answers are expected to be delivered, right? And the lack of that in agriculture creates a situation in which merely asking the questions makes you appear to be a sort of an opponent of the technology, and expecting somebody to answer these questions or to come up with a statement of some of the reasons is discouraged. It's more complicated than that. But what really has brought me around to the idea that we would want to that emphasizing this notion of bioethics is valuable is precisely the point that you were making at the end, that we've created an institutional capacity in the biomedical domain that we need in other domains. And maybe if we got that institutional capacity in engineering schools and agricultural research institutes and so on, we just call it ethics again.
Paul, could I just follow up briefly on Jim's question? How much commonality do you see substantively between agricultural ethics, medical ethics, and environmental ethics?
Well, I started out thinking of myself as an environmental ethicist, and I think there are different philosophical questions that get raised. One of the questions that got raised in the environmental domain and that does overlap into agriculture and is less frequently raised in the medical domain is this notion of ecosystems or populations, and what kind of ethical significance they would have and what kind of obligations, if any, or at least value would be associated with some of those kinds of things. And I think you see that even in some of the questions that I was just talking about in the talk. So that's a kind of a philosophical difference. It's almost a difference in moral ontology, the kind of thing that we're interested in. But I think one of the things that it cuts across all three, but also is a difference, is that the scientific fields, although there's a lot of overlap between agriculture and medicine, in some cases, there are things that we do in agriculture that we get a certain experience and expertise. I saw this in the genetic engineering debate that I think oftentimes people with a medical orientation were much more worried about this because they were, if you create a dysfunctional human being, you've got an ethical problem. If you create a dysfunctional rutabaga, you just throw it in the autoclave and try again. It's not really viewed as so you're actually, what I'm saying is you build a certain kind of technical expertise that has important differences. And so I think one of the things that I would like to see more of in the agricultural side is participation from the technical experts of the sort that we actually see from some of the technical experts in the ATP-Bio project.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to call on Alex Capron and then Nancy Levenger. Alex?
Thank you, Susan. This has been a very interesting and provocative talk, and some of it is sort of memory lane, the aspects of the use by the farm lobby of the kinds of objections that were raised by a broader population in Europe to genetic engineering being applied to agricultural products. And the other main source, which was, besides the bovine stimulating hormone, was in the seeds area, where with all the genetically modified crops that were originally raised as an idea, as a way of feeding the population. We were going to have golden rice that was going to have greater nutritional value and so forth. And it ended up being really a way for Monsanto and others to create Roundup resistant crops so that the farmers had to buy the seeds to be resistant and so forth. I had a question about a point that you raised, which I hadn't really thought of before, and that was the linking of food safety and nutrition, the idea that nutritional value and so forth would be this is viewed in a similar way to food safety. And you showed a map that indicated the areas of greatest food insecurity. But looking at it, I really wondered whether the ATP-Bio approach is going to be helpful if the technology that is needed not only to create, but to distribute and store for use these preserved foods with a higher nutritional value and so forth, is itself unlikely to be accessible in the very countries or regions that were red on your map as indicating the highest level of food insecurity. Do you have any thoughts about that as a overlay to the whole thing.
Right. So there's, it's especially when we're talking about Central Africa, I think many of the issues there are related. They are related to infrastructure as opposed to certainly something like a storage technology. But it's so I think your overall point about ATP biotechnologies is probably correct. But it is, we can envision some of these technologies that associate with animal reproduction actually being able to speed up the genetic development in some of those countries. You're often dealing with breeds, even if we're just still talking about cattle, we might be dealing with breeds that are enough different from the breeds that are highly developed in the industrialized world, in the temperate climates, that we really couldn't just we can't just take a Hereford and put him in the middle of Africa and expect him to do well. So I think some of these technologies could be part of a larger picture that could conceivably benefit producers in these areas. So I wouldn't say it's an issue. Now, having said that, are there food safety issues with that breeding? Probably not. You can't exclude it altogether. It's entirely possible to breed a poisonous potato, and it's been done, and you have to be looking, checking. Generally speaking, we can rely on our agricultural sciences to do that, but it is part of the picture, and it would be reasonable to be asking questions like, what would the longer term nutritional impact be? Can we be confident that it's actually positive?
Okay, Paul, I'm going to call on Nancy Levenger.
I'm going to be really quick because I have to teach in 6 minutes, but I have a question as to whether or not the sort of the way that you presented the biopreservation ethics is in many ways pejorative of things that are happening, or at least the examples. I wonder if there's a way to spin the ethics of biopreservation as a way of mitigating the effects of climate change can be spun up to help the world in terms of anticipating what will happen as our climate warms.
Well, I actually spent quite a bit of time explaining in the ethics of why these innovations in general are good things. So I wouldn't say that I've overemphasized sort of the downside. I just note, and this is something I've noticed throughout my career, that I can go there, I can talk about all these reasons why we want to do innovation, and sometimes the scientists don't hear that as an ethical argument, but it's an ethical argument. You're making an ethical argument. I've even heard scientists stand up at a scientific meeting and devote half their presentation to talking about this kind of stuff, and they don't realize they're making an ethical argument. And it's a positive. And so, it very much is the case that we need to have those positive considerations as part of the picture. If I were speaking to a different group, like, for example, rural sociologists, I might say, well, there you actually do get this very sort of, negative recital of all of the downside. And it's important and ethics is not just a recitation of all of the risks and potential, pitfalls, but it's a conversation, an exchange of reasons, questions that are asked and then answers that are given that addresses these kinds of things. And so, if you heard a lot of negative stuff, remember that I said a lot of positive stuff. And then this sort of feeds back into my larger point, which is that we don't really have this capacity to, to sort of have a holistic kind of picture here. And I think that I wouldn't say that medical bioethics is perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think that that there has been real progress made in actually building a capacity to do this kind of work.
Thank you so much. And I have to split because got a class to teach. So, but
Yeah,
thank you so
thank
much.
you.
Thank you. And Paul, just quickly to build on Nancy's question, as you know, one of the associated projects for ATP-Bio being led by Mary Hagedorn is on envisioning a lunar biorepository,
Mhm.
a faunal biorepository, though it could be more than faunal, as a kind of hedge against catastrophe here on Earth. What do you think ethics, whether it's ag or environmental or food systems, has to offer that envisioning?
Well, certainly there's been a ethical debate about the Svalbard repository, and it often focuses on agricultural questions. You know, I think the you know, when we get sort of over into the conservation area, there's not a lot, you know, it seems like a good thing. How could anybody object to this, right? And we're kind of you know, putting a you know, a worst case scenario of backups and things like that. And that might be true in agriculture too, but in agriculture, there's money to be made and lost on these genetic resources. And we've actually seen a very dramatic retreat in the willingness to share access to just the information. I mean, increasingly now we don't, in the context of agriculture, we don't actually need to save the gene, we just need to save the sequence because we can rebuild the gene. But this is all, the companies that are starting to study this process. I mean, it's to use an analogy that will be familiar to those of you in the biomedical world. Agriculture genetics is starting to look a lot like drug development, where the big companies sequence tons of genes and, you know, start to develop work on what their function might be, but they don't publish any of that because that's all extremely potentially very, very valuable information. You know, 30 years ago, that would have been completely shared. It mostly would have been done at universities. You know, I think that is that's kind of a negative of the whole genetic revolution in agriculture. And we might see that kind of issue come up in the context of a lunar repository. Just sharing the materials themselves has been one of the issues because some smaller countries, usually it's the smaller countries that feel like they have valuable genetic resources, they don't want to share that with, you know, Bayer and, you know, some of the seed companies. You know, they want to say, well, we saved this for us, but don't give it to those guys, right? And so that's the kind of thing that I could see coming up.
So let's squeeze in one more. Karkit, can you have a quick version of your question, and Paul, maybe a quick answer?
I don't know if I can do a quick version of anything. Paul, great talk. And I think you're right. We are techno-optimist by design and definition almost. It's hard to kind of get us around that. It is what it is. But these are great like things that technology adopted wrongly. I'll actually circle back to Alex's point. These are good examples of like technology can go where you'd never envisioned Monsanto taking over everything. I'm sure the geneticists at the time were thinking they're gonna, you know, make food much cheaper and available to everybody. But one of the things we really haven't done, we are getting into the food side very early. For me, it's almost non-existent. I haven't done anything. John has done a few things ahead of me. I think the design specs are very different. In medical world, in the field of transplantation, I don't care about the cost. That will eventually take care of itself. Technology will get cheap. And this can't be like an argument at all for food and agriculture and aquaculture. So maybe one of the ideas, and this is possibly a future discussion, Susan, or some kind of white paper, to actually design what cryopreservation can help you with. I actually looked into some UN reports, I think the FAO, And they said like about 40, a third of all the food we produce is lost. About 15% of it is due to lack of refrigeration, which might be simply the electricity goes away in your Central African country. So maybe the goal is actually develop preservation technologies, and I'm not talking about just doing, jam, that can actually preserve the food without need for such active, whatever lacking infrastructure is, which again is very different from the problems we deal with, but will be a fascinating design problem for all of us on the call.
Just briefly, I think that, your point, cost is going to be important in agriculture. And I would just generalize that observation to the point that I was making about, all of these things are extensions of things that we're already doing. And so anything new has to be better than what we're already doing. And that often means it has to be cheaper. So that I think does maybe make a little bit of difference between the way some of these issues, I mean, you can't leave the economics out of it in agriculture. And I would say, unfortunately, it's often the case that the economists are, the final word on things, and some of the other considerations just don't get brought up and discussed.
I want to also thank Barbara Reed for her comment in the QA function about plant cryobiology. It's used in many countries to store the plant germplasm for plant breeders to use later as needed. And her reminder that golden rice, the enormous benefits, that no one is required to buy or use engineered seeds. So folks may just want to take a look at Barbara's more extended comment in the Q&A. I know we're up against our time limit, so I just want to thank all of you. Great questions, and especially Paul. I think this is the start, or really for many of us, the continuation of a really crucial conversation to bring into central focus a domain of ethics that often is neglected in favor of medical ethics or even environmental ethics. So we're indebted to you, Paul, for keeping us focused on this crucial area, particularly because it's central to much of what ATP-Bio is trying to develop. So thanks to you, Paul, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Alyssa, did
Thanks,
you
Paul.
have any final?
No, thank you, Susan. That was great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul, as well.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, folks. Paul, I thought that was great, and it's incredibly provocative in terms of, as you pass the baton, who do you pass the baton to?